Hey y'all, so today I'm a little bit nervous for you because today we're learning about MLA. And I know this is the part of the class where students sometimes just hate it. So I want to start talking about MLA and I want you to relax because it's easy. And you know, it's maybe not the easiest thing in the world, but honestly, it's something that can be done if you use the books that are given to you to work with. So, with that being said, let's talk about it. So what is MLA? Well, MLA stands for the Modern Language Association, which basically that is a formatting style that obviously English uses, but I would think any of the humanities use. And so when I say humanities, I'm thinking like fine arts, I'm thinking Spanish, communications, sometimes history. History sometimes has its own though. So you may use it a lot, especially in your first 2 years of college. And so this is the MLA handbook. Okay. And so we'll move on. And so why do you use it? So basically you use this for a couple reasons. You use it to cross-reference. And so what I mean by that is if I'm looking at Wikipedia and I find something that I'm like, oh, I would like to use that in my paper, but your teacher said, well, you can't use Wikipedia. Well, chances are that information that you loved is cited in Wikipedia. So if you go down to the bottom to the references page, they'll probably have a citation there. And that citation, if you find out that it's probably a credible source or a good source, you can use that source in your paper and you still, or the information that you want to use, you still can use. And so that's great, and that's what cross-referencing is. So it also provides a consistent format within the discipline. So what that means is really if we were just given our own devices, we could cite things a million different ways. So it just makes it more consistent, which makes it easier for your instructor to read, but I think it just makes it easier for you to do as well. If you try to remember 15 different ways of doing it, it would be harder. Okay, so it gives you credibility as a writer. So number one, using credible sources gives you credibility, but being able to cite and show those credible sources even builds your credibility more. Okay, and then it protects you from plagiarism. And basically how it protects you is if you have somebody else's ideas and you show that this is that other person's ideas, you're protected. Now, there are multiple different ways you can plagiarize. Obviously, there's the cut and paste. And then there's also taking like another person's work. Probably in both of those situations, you are not going to have that citation. And then there's probably the more lightweight, where you won't get in as much trouble, way to plagiarize where you just have in-text citations that are incorrect. Those most teachers will just let you fix. So I wouldn't stress out too much about that, especially when you're an MLA novice. Okay? So when should you use parenthetical citations? I wanted to go ahead and show you what a parenthetical citation was. And so basically what that is, at the end of your quote, summary, or paraphrasing, you'll have the author's name and the page number. We'll talk more about that in a second, but I wanted you to know what I meant when I said parenthetical citations, parentheses. So you'll use it when you quote. And so basically quoting means you take the direct words that the author said and you use them. Just put it in quotation marks. If you don't put it in quotation marks, it's going to count as plagiarism. So make sure if you're going to take exact words, you put it in quotation marks and then you put the parenthetical at the end. Okay? And so then you also have to put the parenthetical citation at the end of a summary or a paraphrasing. And so that means you have those same words, but in a summary, you condense it and you make it shorter. Okay? And then a paraphrasing is basically taking those ideas and putting them in your own words. So my biggest thing with these is like it feels like a summary is shorter and a paraphrasing is about the same length as that quote. Either one of those, they don't go in quotation marks, but they still get the in-text citation. Okay? Okay, so then you have to think about how you're going to work these quotations into your paper and into your sentences. And so most people will say, most English teachers will say that whenever you want to fit a quotation smoothly into your essay, you need to use a signal phrase. And a signal phrase is basically starting the reader's mind knowing that you were about to have a quote. And so I want to show you, according to Bloom's critical analysis of The Old Waiter, this right here, all of that is the signal phrase. Then we have our quotation, and then we have our citation. And so there's a million different ways that you can use signal phrases. And so I gave you a whole list of signal phrases that you can use here. And so they're great. It's just different ways that you can say says. So you could say the author speculates or the author asserts. And it just sounds a little bit more fancy, really. But if you are quoting somebody a lot, you don't want to say the author says, the author says, the author says over and over again. Okay, and so basically then we know that we have to introduce our quote and then we have to have our quote. But you need something else. So anytime you have a quote, introduce it with a signal phrase. Give your quote, give your citation, but then don't stop. You have to tell us why you put that quote in there. Why is this important? So you have to explain yourself. So I have this kind of funny thing that I took off the internet, so it's nothing huge, but I thought this was the best kind of picture of it. It's called a quote sandwich. And so basically, in your top bun, you'll introduce. In your meat or meat substitute, you will have your quotation and your citation. And then your bottom bun is the explanation. Why is it important? What does this mean? What does this mean for your paper? How does it connect with your ideas? And so usually, and this is I think great, it needs to be at least as long or longer than the quote itself. So think about that. You never end a paragraph on a quote because you haven't explained it, right? And I really wouldn't end a paper on a quote for sure. So keep that in your mind. Now think about how great that is, because if you are somebody who doesn't ever get the page minimum, here you go. I mean, every time you quote, you have to have all of that. I mean, that's almost a paragraph in and of itself. So it really works. Being a good writer takes a lot of space. And so then we're going to start talking about in-text citations, which are parenthetical citations, and how they work with the works cited page. Anytime you have that parenthetical citation in your paper, you absolutely have to have a correlating entry on your works cited page. And almost always, the thing that is in your parenthetical citation is going to be the first word of your entry, and I'll give you some examples of that. Okay, so let's talk about our quote here. And I think this one actually, the second one, is a little bit of a better example. Romantic poetry is characterized by, quote, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And so we know that Wordsworth is the person who said that. So we have our kind of leading up to it, then we have our quote, then we have our citation. And if you look at this top one, it does basically the same thing, except we said Wordsworth said. So anyway, that's our in-text parenthetical citation right here, Wordsworth 263. So if you were to look at that entry on a works cited page, guess what's first? Is it Wordsworth? It's Wordsworth. Yeah, so it's almost always that, and it's always the author's last name. Okay? And I'm going to show you one. What if we don't have an author? Okay, well, if you don't have an author, you're going to use the title of the article or essay would be the next thing that you use. And it's kind of interesting. If you don't have an author, the next thing is title. And if you don't have a title, then I don't think you should use that source. So anyway, so what I've got here is an example of a work with no author, The Impact of Climate Change in North America. So what I have is I have my quote. Again, it's introduced. I have my quote. And then I have the title. And that's what I do here. But couple things here. Number one, it's in quotation marks because it's an article title, so it'll be in quotation marks. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then basically we have our page number. So you might say, well, that's not the same thing. You can actually shorten the title in your in-text citation just to make it more readable, because the goal of MLA is not to take up all the space with the title. You want to make sure that the author knows which source you're talking about, but you don't have to do a whole lot more there. So if I can figure out the impact of climate change is this article, then that's good. Okay? So these are just the basics, and you can get this from the Purdue Owl, so I'm not going to go too much into this, but basically on your paper, your last name and page number still appear at the top right corner. The works cited, when you write works cited, it's centered, not bolded, not italicized, not underlined. The entries are in alphabetical order by the first letter of the entry. We'll talk about that. And then this one is really important, and we'll talk about it more, but you'll use a hanging indent. So that means the second line and every line after it is indented. Okay, and so I want to show you what this looks like. So here's a sample works cited page. Couple things. Number one, double spaced. You see that? Pretty easy. And then you see that we have everything, basically most of our sources have authors, and so we have alphabetized by author name. But then, what is this? An inconvenient truth. Well, that's the title of a movie, and movies are always done a little bit weird. But so, with that one, what we've done is we don't use the articles, so an a, and a the, we usually don't use. And so that's why it's alphabetized by I there. Okay, and so I want to talk a little bit about the hanging indent. So basically what we have is this top line sticks out, the next line indented. And if we have multiple, like this example, basically every line after the first one is indented. And the reason, look at this, you can almost obviously tell why, because I think if you understand why, you're more likely to do it. If the first line sticks out, then you know when the next one starts because it sticks out. And you know where the next one starts because it sticks out. So that's really why we do it. And I'll show you how to actually set this up when I talk about the MLA activity. There's a lot of stuff, you guys. So I think the best sources that you can use, I have a couple sources that I think are pretty good. Number one, the OWL at Purdue. So I'm going to show you how a book would be cited. So I have this linked into your page, but the OWL at Purdue, it's annoying because it has like commercials sometimes, but it's a great source. Sometimes I use this one probably the most because it's really easy and it's at your fingertips. But it shows you how to cite a book. And so you can cite a book with one author or more than one author, 2 books by the same author. And then if you're like, okay, well, that's just books. Well, yeah, but they also have periodicals, something we use a little bit more, electronic sources. And then another thing that I think is very helpful, another thing that I use a lot is if you go to your little seagull, and this is the reason I think you need it for this class, if you go to your little seagull, the green section is MLA. I'm going to refer to this a lot more in that activity because basically there's a lot that goes into that activity, and I think whenever we do that together, you'll see what we have. And so if you have this book, you may have this book online. If you're in English 011, I know you do, so you can actually find this stuff online as well, and it's the same information, so you don't have to go out and buy this book if you have the online version. Okay, and so I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. So that's how you would find a book. And then I want to show you something that's neat. And this is going to be really important to your argument. So if you go to NC Live, I'm just taking you to the library page, and I click on NC Live over here. So if I go here and I type in climate change, so if I go in here and I type in climate change, you find an article. And so I'm trying to remember which one I used a minute ago. This one looks fine. So what happens here is, of course now it's moving slow. A fun thing that the NC Lab does do for you is it actually cites it for you. So if you go to your citation, you can see how they do it. Number one, make sure you change it from APA to MLA. And then what I do is, I copy it, Control C, and then I go into a blank document, and what I'll do is I'll paste it. And I like to go ahead and do, I like to do merge formatting. And so this doesn't look correct at all, but it's halfway there. It's in Times New Roman and it's 12-point font. So a couple things I do is I make sure that both of these things are set to 0 because I have to fix that hanging indent, and that's the biggest issue here. So you may hit tab, and that's all you have to do. Oh no, it tabbed everything in. Basically how you fix that is you just hit enter, and then it lets you tab everything in. So now I have an article that looks correct. Yay. And so in a little while, I'm going to make another video about the MLA activity, and I think that's going to put a lot of the stuff that we've learned to practice, but I just feel like I don't want to overwhelm you. So this is what that would look like. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is probably the place where you will have questions, and so we're navigating this together. Y'all, okay. Have a good day.